Hello and welcome to This Week in Global Development. I'm Adva Saldinger, a senior reporter here at Devex, and your host today to talk about all the latest news in global development, and it has been a busy week. Today, I am joined by our CEO and editor-in-chief, Raj Kumar, and Elissa Miolene, who is a reporter here at Devex who has been at the forefront of our coverage on everything happening with USAID. I think the place to start this week is we've been talking a lot about sort of the foreign aid review. And Elissa, you had a piece that really sort of looked at some of the ongoing confusion or questions about where things stand with this review, which, has is technically officially over, but there still seems to be some ongoing components of it. And so maybe I'll turn to you and ask a little bit about that first, and then we can dive into what I see as sort of maybe the next phase of conversations that are starting to happen.
Absolutely. So to your point, Adva, I think we had thought and presumed that the review was over for a little bit of time now. This has been something that has been repeated kind of in the court system and also just on social media and various things. But what we found out last week was that USAID staff were still very much being told to review programs and in some cases uncancel certain programs that had been canceled. So as of last week, the view was very much live and continuing. The really interesting piece that we reported on the 14th was that days after Secretary of State Marco Rubio tweeted out a particular number of awards that he wanted to retain 1,000, staff were told, okay, now you have to go and uncancel and recancel so that it lines up to that tweet. So that was just one kind of indication of how kind of back and forth this process has been. And, I was talking to USAID folks who were working on this process, and they were just saying, we're trying to retroactively figure out how the team got to that number, right? So it was a lot of kind of back and forth of we don't really know the rationale, but we'll try our best, and what's life-saving and what's not. And a lot of those were related to the food assistance and life-saving humanitarian assistance. Much of which had already gotten canceled. So that kind of brings us to this week and late last week when we kind of were hearing about, okay, now that these reviews seem to be over at this point, or at least the phase of that review is over, what's next? And what will happen to those, say, 1,000 or so programs that are estimated to stay on the table?
I think that's sort of the perfect transition, because one of the things that's emerging is that there seem to be a number of potential proposals floating around. It doesn't seem, at least certainly not publicly, that the administration has landed on a specific path forward for what they want to see foreign assistance look like. But what I think is worth talking about is really getting into what do some of those proposals tell us? What indications can we get from some of those? And I know Elissa and I are also working on a story trying to get, some expert opinions and takes on one of the latest proposals that we've seen. But Raj, maybe you want to weigh in a little bit on what you're hearing about these proposals, what you make of them, what's in them.
Yeah, the way I'm thinking about this and talking about it is that there's three phases. Phase one was tearing it all down. That's not necessarily over, as Alyssa says. There's still activity, certainly in some of the smaller agencies, as we've been reporting on, USIP and U.S. African Development Foundation and others. But phase two, we're also in at the same time. They're kind of, going on at the same time. And phase two is, what does the administration decide to do in terms of restructuring U.S. foreign assistance architecture? And then maybe phase three, which we may or may not get to, is when Congress gets involved, and they're really not right now. So phase two is interesting because, as you say, there isn't one proposal. It's pretty clear there are different ideas. There are people with different levels of influence in the administration, maybe with even different worldviews. So what do we know? I feel like there's a few things we can guess looking at these proposals that are likely to come out. I think one is the Development Finance Corporation is likely to be the sort of tip of the spear of U.S. global development engagement. It just seems like it has a lot of political backing. The administration, many actors in the administration seem to believe in it and care about it. They might be thinking of it beyond development, angles. They might be thinking about it in terms of like sovereign wealth fund and doing other foreign policy work, but it does seem like DFC has a lot of political momentum. And one of these proposals that's out there suggests even that the Millennium Challenge Corporation and the U.S. Trade and Development Agency would get folded into DFC. So I think that's one thing.
And that's actually not a new proposal. That's something that we've heard for several years, including in the first Trump administration. It didn't happen when the DFC was created, but it was something that was sort of floated and discussed at the time. So that I think isn't a total surprise, but how functionally you would do that with three agencies that have quite different mandates and methodologies, I think is part of the question.
Yeah, I mean, the good news is they're all small. Unlike USAID, which had 10,000 employees, these are pretty small agencies with just a few hundred in each case. So it would be easier to figure out a way forward, maybe. But I think DFC is one big part. I think the other part is it's pretty clear that the State Department is going to absorb a lot of the core humanitarian functions of USAID. Exactly how it's structured, even how it's named, seems to be a question mark across the different proposals we're hearing. But it seems like the State Department is taking on this sort of a role. And I guess I'd say the last thing that seems fairly clear at this stage is that Congress is just a bystander in phase two, as I talk about it. So it's much more about the factions inside the administration that matter. So if you're an advocate on the outside, you want to influence this debate. It seems like the way to do that is dealing with the power centers in the administration who all might have very different ideas about what ought to happen. I'm hearing, different agencies being talked about: CDC, DOD, USDA, right? There's a lot of different players that may take up pieces of this. And there is some chance in terms of like a silver lining that you get a better structure, like you get something that's actually logical and makes sense out of this process. But that's not a guarantee. And it's going to really depend on how this unfolds over the coming weeks and whose voice is loudest and has most influence in the Trump administration.
Yeah, I think one of the things certainly that I'm hearing in terms of sort of a congressional role, I mean, I covered a hearing last week about DFC reauthorization. It actually was like one of the few seemingly bipartisan issues that existed, at least at the subcommittee level. So I thought that was interesting. And I think, sort of aligns with what you're hearing, including plans to really dramatically increase it. Now, a lot of those aligned with what we were hearing from the reauthorization last year. The one proposal that we saw to fold MCC and USTDA in would require other significant changes as well. But I think there's also a lot of information that lawmakers on the Hill don't have, that they want to have, that they're not getting from the administration right now. So, and we've seen this in a number of letters that have come out, but also just hearing, even from people who aren't saying it publicly, including some Republicans, that they want answers about what are the programs that are still existing, what has been terminated, what drove this review process, and those things. So I think Congress has been kind of sidelined, but I think there's a question about how they engage and at what moments and where there's political will. This latest proposal includes some, basically makes clear that the administration understands they would have to go to Congress and get authorization or at least notify Congress for certain things. So I think but how and when they do that, I think are all open questions. But I think it also indicates that we're very likely to see a rescission. So while we did see a budget bill that got passed that funded foreign assistance at the same levels as fiscal year 2024, it seems very clear that the administration will ask Congress to essentially claw back or rescind a significant amount of that funding, including for all of the canceled programs. Elissa, I want to turn back to you because one of the other things that we saw, curious for you to weigh in on these proposals, including, one that you wrote about that we saw from Tim Meisberger, who was sort of talked about a particular proposal in a closed door meeting. And then also we've seen some changes in sort of leadership at USAID. So hoping you can talk about that as well.
Definitely. So I think just to reiterate, this was a lot of what we've been talking about was encapsulated by a quote that was passed along to me from notes of someone in the meeting, which you've just referred to, Adva, which is most of the madness is behind us, was something that Tim Meisberger told folks who were in the meeting. And I think that again just points to this phase that we're in, this next step, right? And the fact that perhaps some of the cutting and some of the program eliminations that we've seen are solid. Let's see going forward. I have, just a caveat, heard of several being canceled again this week after being uncanceled. So let's see how that continues to play out. But I did just want to, I think, highlight the fact that both in Meisberger's proposal that he laid out to staff in this closed door meeting and the memo that Raj has just been going through and that Adva has just been going through, the biggest similarity that I've seen between those two is just a really sharp refocusing of USAID around humanitarian response. So this is kind of carving out a lot of the development work that USAID has traditionally done, including democracy, governance, and human rights, which for a long time was, something that was kind of championed by both parties. So just to kind of crystallize that a little bit, I pulled up the reorg memo in front of me, and I'm just kind of reading off of it. And this is what this particular memo of, as we said, several ideas wants to cut includes democracy, inclusive growth, partnerships, and innovation, the Bureau for Legislative and Public Affairs, resilience, environment, and food security. So that's a lot of like the ag work that was going on, nutrition, food, etc. Though there's some caveats in that some might be kept. But again, let's see how these play out. This is just a proposal. Also the office of the chief economist. So there's a lot of kind of interesting pieces of this puzzle that will be eliminated. And to me, how that reads again is swiping out a lot of development focused work and really refocusing on humanitarian response. And you even see that in the new name of the proposed bureau or rather the underneath the State Department. This memo is proposing that the U.S. Agency for International Development is renamed the U.S. Agency for International Humanitarian Assistance. So that's just one way in which this will be resharpened and refocused. I think there's lots of changes there to come. You mentioned that we heard yesterday that Peter Marocco, who has been kind of the person who many people attribute to kind of leading the charge to carve out USAID and really make sure that these cuts happen, not just at USAID, but also at the U.S. Agency for the U.S. African Development Foundation, the U.S. Institute of Peace, etc., and the Inter-American Foundation. But yesterday we found out that he's actually leaving, so he's going back to the State Department. So that'll be a reshuffling again at the leadership level. I will say that someone close to the matter who I spoke with yesterday described the reshuffling as a changing of chairs around on the Titanic. So kind of thinking that a lot of the things that are going forward will continue. And that's in part because of who has been promoted to deputy admin roles. So that's both Jeremy Lewin, who is a Dodge staffer that's been quite visible throughout this process at USAID, and Kenneth Jackson, who is the current USAID assistant to the administrator for management and resources. So both those folks will now have deputy admin roles, and it seems that they will continue to lead the charge forward of phase 2 of the final reviews, whatever that might mean, and what's next for USAID.
Right. So one of them is effectively a CFO, one is effectively a COO, but there is no CEO, right? I mean, and that's why I wonder when people say Pete Marocco is leaving, he was still the head of F, right? He was still the head of the
Yes.
office of
Yeah.
foreign. So he's not really leaving. And in fact, now that everything is going to state, he sort of still retains, it seems, the same basic authority as the leader of this institution, or what's
He
left.
just no longer has a formal role at USAID, right? And I think
Right.
the acting administrator is still Rubio. Probably not, especially as this transition happens. So, but functionally, maybe on a day-to-day level or in some decision making for what's left of USAID, maybe. And maybe he'll redirect his focus a little bit more broadly to sort of whatever the next phase is. I think some of that is unclear, and we'll see how that moves forward. One of the things that you both mentioned, I think, is USIP and the U.S. African Development Foundation. We have seen, I think, in the court challenges, some developments in the U.S. ADF case. Elissa, I'm curious if you can update us there and just give us a sense of what we saw at the United States Institute of Peace, which is USIP this week as well, which seems to follow a pattern we've seen.
Yeah. So the events that happened at the U.S. Institute of Peace, they follow events that happened at the U.S. African Development Foundation and the Inter-American Foundation. So all three of these entities were targeted in a executive order that came out on February 19th. So at that time, President Trump said, I'm ordering that these institutions be reduced to their statutory requirements. And what I had been hearing from folks at those organizations is that they were working to do that. So whether that be kind of putting a plan in place for reducing programs or reducing staff, and having conversations with people in the administration to do that work. We had a flurry of reporting on USADF in earlier weeks, and that was really kind of talking about the fact that DOJ staff and Peter Marocco, who we've just mentioned, came into their offices and tried to get in and tried to get access to their systems. And this kind of led to this culmination of events where they did eventually get access into the building. Just yesterday, I heard from USAID staffers that they were placed on administrative leave. And the interesting thing I think about that is that they were placed on administrative leave by Peter Marocco's direction. And the last thing that we heard from the judge in that case was that Trump actually doesn't have the authority to designate Peter Marocco as the leader of that organization. But kind of to be safe, the organization is complying, USADF is complying, and staff are now not working who have been given those memos. So it's a really interesting situation there and in all three of these institutions. But for this particular case with USADF, the legal ramifications and the legal case is still live. So the next update on that will be tomorrow when both parties will submit more information. But I think they have until sometime in mid-April for this to actually be figured out and actually decided on. In terms of the U.S. Institute of Peace, this is something that happened after all of the craziness at USADF. So we've been reporting that the U.S. Institute of Peace, which is kind of an interesting type of organization that is a nonprofit but gets the majority of its funding from Congress. It also has strong ties to Congress, so Senate confirmed board members and that kind of thing. But they received a twin set of meetings on Friday that were unexpected by DOJ staffers and 2 FBI agents. So that happened on Friday afternoon. Over the weekend, there was some action between, again, the FBI and the folks who were leading the U.S. Institute of Peace. So that included visits to households of members of staff, calls to members of staff. And then on Monday evening, that ended up culminating in another visit from DOJ staffers and Kenneth Jackson, who we've actually just mentioned before. He was named to be the new president. And they did get in and they did kind of proceed to go through systems and go through, files and that kind of thing. So they have taken over that building at this stage. And the U.S. Institute of Peace, just like the USADF, is now engaged in a court battle for control of the agency.
Yeah,
Raj, I'm curious. Go ahead.
I think it's just maybe worth for listeners, especially those who are not in the United States, to kind of get a feel for the two sides of this argument, right? I mean, first of all, USIP, Institute of Peace, is this beautiful, pretty new building right down on the mall. It's right next to the State Department. It's next to the Federal Reserve. It's kind of an iconic space here in DC. It might sound like a minor NGO, but it's not. And obviously, it is a government-created and funded entity. And it's been the scene of this massive drama, as you say, Elissa. So I think the proponents of the way U.S. foreign assistance works, the kind of traditional approach would say, this is crazy. I mean, they brought FBI agents, they brought D.C. police. They ended up really trying to strong arm using the U.S. Attorney's Office, like strong arm this independent entity, and they're trying to take over the board, going around Congress, etc. And it's really unlike anything we've ever seen. On the other hand, I guess the other viewpoint would be, hey, Congress over many years created all of these relatively small independent bureaucracies. They're part of the sort of deep state or administrative state. They just keep growing and taking taxpayer money. What do they really achieve? Are they really aligned with the president's agenda? And that ultimately the president has the authority to determine, issues of national security and foreign policy. And that sort of supersedes whatever the rules might be about how the board gets constituted by Congress. And so you've got this real clash of worldviews, and it's ending up in the courts almost certainly. But it doesn't seem, at least at this stage, that Congress is sort of standing up for their rights to defend USIP or U.S. African Development Foundation, right? So it seems likely that unless the courts are able to really change the dynamic, probably by the time Congress does have a voice, maybe in the new budget toward the end of this year, they're probably not going to stand up and defend these institutions. it does seem like we're watching the destruction of at least some of these relatively small, but proponents would argue really important institutions to U.S. Soft power around the world getting taken out, and that Congress is sort of just allowing that to happen. Whether or not you agree with the way it's happening, it's sort of happening.
Yeah, and I think one of the things I wanted to mention is that one of the court cases that we did see a decision in this week, or at least a preliminary decision, was a legal challenge brought by employees and contractors of USAID against Elon Musk and DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency. And one of the things that the judge in that case found was that the president's sort of foreign policy powers do have limits. And that's an argument that the administration has used in quite a few of these legal challenges, that the president has quite wide foreign policy powers to make decisions. And in that particular challenge, legal challenge, the judge found that actually this was more related to an organizational structural issue rather than a matter of policy, and found that because of that, the legal challenge would likely succeed. It didn't, it basically constrained DOGE from making decisions around USAID or further cuts, etc. But it basically said that things that were done by the appropriate authorities, either under the authority of Marco Rubio or other, appointed USAID employees, were legal. But there were a couple decisions where DOGE did not have the authority to make them, including around shutting down the building and taking the website offline and things like that, that they didn't have the authority to do and didn't get the appropriate authority from the government. So I think some of those, we see lots of echoes across the legal arguments, I think, in terms of what we're seeing sort of on both sides, the people bringing lawsuits against the government and those in the government arguments. So I think it's interesting to sort of see how some of these arguments evolve and how the judicial system will bring things forward.
Yeah,
Raj,
ultimately, if this makes it up to the Supreme Court, will the Supreme Court, have a definitive view on the limits of presidential authority around foreign policy? I don't know the answer to that, but I just wonder. It seems to me like this judge's ruling doesn't help aid proponents very much. It talks about Elon Musk's own words, how he says, we canceled an Ebola project and we brought it back. So he's using his own words to say DOGE is doing things they don't have the authority to do. But it seems thin because ultimately you would think Marco Rubio could just say, well, I approve all of that. Or the president can say, well, I approve all of that. And then it's not so much a constitutional issue according to the way this judge is viewing things.
yeah. And that's actually like the judge has given them an opening for like shutting down the building. They can just provide a letter to the court saying that Marco Rubio has authorized that and that would sort of fulfill one of the requirements. So I think you're absolutely right. I think some of these legal challenges have sort of limited impact or application. And we'll see as they progress through the process, or if they go up to higher courts, whether we see more sort of rulings or discussions on the actual constitutional matters that might be underlining.
Yeah, and I think it's important for listeners who are, because I get this question a lot, people are, well, is USA going to come back? Is this pendulum going to swing and it'll come back? Or will some of these smaller agencies you've been covering, Elissa, will they, survive legal challenges and come back? And we don't know for sure. Anything's possible. But boy, it does seem like the way the administration is approaching this is working. Their strategy is working, which is change the facts on the ground. Don't wait for Congress. Go ahead and actually find a way in and close these entities down. And then you control the politics around it. And ultimately, Congress doesn't say a word because they realize the political winds are in favor of what the president is doing. And so Congress essentially ends up adopting what the White House has achieved. So whether or not you agree with the way they did it, whether you think it's legal or not, yes, it goes through the courts. But unless the courts make a really strong stand at some point at the Supreme Court, chances are these are permanent changes.
Yeah. And I think there's also fundamental questions, even if the courts would make a decision at some point down the road, whether you could actually resurrect some of these institutions or whether things are sort of too far done and gone. And to your point, I think that's been the strategy. We're just going to do it. And then maybe like at this point, you couldn't reconstitute USAID in the way that it looked a few months ago. and I think at least what I'm hearing from employees is that there's plenty of people who wouldn't want to go back, right? Because a lot of that trust has been lost. So yeah, I'm curious from either of you, what do you have your eye on in the week ahead? What do you think we'll sort of see in terms of developments on this front or on some of these proposals that are coming forward?
I mean, for me, one of the things I'm interested in are the remaining appointments and confirmation hearings. I don't exactly know when all of them are scheduled or if all of them are scheduled, but some of the key roles at Treasury, obviously Ben Black, who's been appointed, nominated for DFC. I think his hearings will be really illuminating. I just think that's probably the next place where we start to hear a little bit more of what the White House itself thinks. Because, of course, right now we're getting these memos and these, meeting notes, and we're kind of getting a sense for what different people think. But ultimately, the president is going to be the one who decides, and different people are going to have his ear and try to, present their case to him. And maybe through nomination hearings, confirmation hearings, in the Senate, we'll get the best, most distilled version of what the White House actually thinks. What does the White House see for the MDBs? I think that's a really big question. The multilateral development banks, World Bank, and others. That's a big conversation topic at dinners in this town. What happens to the MDBs? And then I think what happens to the DFC, and of course, subsidiary to that maybe is the MCC. Like, that's what a lot of people are trying to understand. And these proposals that are coming around help, but the confirmation hearings might help even more.
Yeah, my understanding is that we haven't seen appointments yet for the relevant Treasury positions related to international affairs. So that's something we're definitely still waiting on. And at least the last time I checked in, I think end of last week with DFC on whether there's a nomination hearing set for Benjamin Black, and it was not yet on the calendar. So I think there's still some things in the works. We might not see those immediately. I think another point where we might see some direction for what the White House wants is in the president's budget request, which I think will give us a sense of what they want the budget to look like for fiscal year 2026. I think we should see that maybe within the next month, but it's unclear exactly sort of where things are in that process. And people aren't really even hearing, at least that I've been speaking to, hearing rumors about when we might see that. But I think that might give us an indication of what issues they want to focus on and how they want to fund things as well. Elissa, any final thoughts on your end?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like you both covered it. The only other thing that I would mention is we're continuing to track these cases in court. So let's see what happens. Let's see how these all play out. But stay tuned for our reporting, and we'll be there to give you the latest.
Great. Well, Elissa and Raj, thank you both so much. It's a pleasure to talk to you today. And to all of our listeners, please subscribe and rate. We look forward to seeing you next week.